Thanks for joining us today for this new program of Venezuelan American Association of the U.S., also known as VAUS. I'm Carlos Ivan Lopez. I'm a vice president with VAUS, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's conversation. Today's topic is After the Elections, a discussion with Eric Farnsworth and Ricardo Penfold. Today's co-moderators will be our VAUS president, Michael Skoll, and myself. Sunday presidential election in Venezuela produced entirely predictable results. No one is surprised. Voters turned out massively to support opposition candidate Edmundo González. He should have been declared the president-elect, but then the Maduro regime denied the truth and declared Maduro the winner. As we all know, that happened on Sunday night. As usual, this happens after Sunday at midnight, they come up with these announcements. Protests arose around the country yesterday. Some violence has emerged. Democratic governments cried fraud, and the likes of Cuba, Russia, and Iran congratulated Maduro. Also, not a surprise. Looks like we're watching the same movie we have seen before in many of the elections in Venezuela. Today, we will discuss what happens next. Negotiations, more violence, more immigration to the US and other countries, a return to sanctions, and further collapse of the economy. We're going to make a short intro into our invitees today. Eric Farnsworth is a vice president of the Council of Americas and American Society. Eric has led the Washington office of the Council of Americas and the American Society since 2003. He maintains an important thought leadership and advocacy role across a broad range of issues affecting the Western Hemisphere, including US relations, economic development, trade and energy, Asia, Latin American relations, and global governance issues, security, and democracy. He's a widely sought-after conference speaker and media commentator, and has published numerous articles and opinion pieces in leading newspapers and policy journals. He began his career in Washington, D.C. with the U.S. Department of State. He served in positions of increasing responsibility in the foreign policy and trade communities, culminating a 3.5-year appointment as a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for Americas. Previously, Mr. Farnsworth was managing director of Manat Jones Global Strategies. He also worked in the Global Public Policy Division of Bristol Myers Squibb, and in the U.S. Senate with Sam Nunn, and the U.S. House of Representatives with John Edward Porter, Republican from Illinois. In 2016, he was decorated by the King of Spain for his work to promote bilateral and regional relations. Ricardo Penfold is a managing director and head of EM research at Seaport Global. Mr. Penfold spent over 3 decades, he has over 3 decades of professional experience. Most recently, he was a managing director at Goldman Sachs Asset Management in New York, where he ran macro analysis and portfolio management, generating and managing investments for global fixed income currency portfolios. Previously, he was a vice president and chief economist at Santander Investment in Caracas, where he ran fixed income equity and equity research. Ricardo's experience include advisory and strategic planning roles for the Venezuelan Ministry of Finance, Corporación Andina de Fomento, and Petróleos de Venezuela. He holds a bachelor's degree from Boston University and a master's degree from University of Pennsylvania, where he also pursued PhD studies. Since our program today will conclude with a Q&A session, you may write any questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the page, and Mike will present them. We ask media representatives attending today to give credit to VAUS, as well as the speaker, of course, in any coverage of this program. Off with you, Michael, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Well, all of this is, entirely predictable. Last year, years before, Maduro makes a free election impossible. Opposition gets massive support from the people. The regime announces victory. Democracies denounce fraud. So here we are, as Carlos said, apparently in the same old movie. But some of you will know that there have been movie sequels which have been better than the originals. We are all hoping that the Venezuelan horror show will eventually turn out differently this time. Eric, what's your prognostication?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me back. VAUS is doing some really important work, and you and Carlos and Ivan are right in the forefront. It's good to join you, and frankly, it's good to be here with Ricardo as well, who probably has forgotten more about these issues than I would ever know, but it's really good to be with all of you. The one thing, though, Carlos, Ivan, that you neglected in my bio to say was that when I worked at the State Department, I actually worked with Michael Skoll. And he was the one who indeed helped train me and caused me to really focus on some of these issues going back now. What is it, Mike? About 25, 30 years. So it's been a while, but it's been a good journey. Look, I mean, I think it's hard to predict. Obviously, it's interesting. The road up to the elections on Sunday, in some ways, were extremely predictable. In fact, several of us on this call have been writing precisely this scenario and suggesting what was going to happen based on the breadcrumbs that the Maduro regime was throwing on the ground to lead us to this ultimate conclusion. I never thought that the election, not only would they not be free and fair, I never thought that Maduro had any intention of leaving, even in the likelihood that he lost the actual vote. And indeed, so far, that's proven to be the case. I think what's taken a lot of people by surprise, and I think this is relevant to trying to answer your question, Michael, is the brazenness with which the regime has committed fraud. I mean, they haven't even tried to hide it. It's just crude. The vote counts that have come out that the opposition has released, now over 80%, I understand, of the voting precincts. The opposition now has the actual records of the votes, indicate quite clearly that Edmundo Gonzalez not just won, but won in a landslide by 70% to 30%, or some, 71 to 29 or something like that. But I mean, that's the range, which in politics, it's almost like it was an undisputed, race, right? It was almost like there was only one person in the race. That's how significant the margin of victory is. So we're not talking about, some problems with this precinct or that voting machine, or, some irregularity. We're talking about a massive, indisputable wipeout that the regime has nonetheless said didn't happen. And by the way, our statistics indicate that, Nicolas Maduro received 51.2% of the votes. I love the specificity. It's very Soviet, it's like 51.2% of the votes, really. And Edmundo Gonzalez won, 10 percentage points or so lower than that. And then an array of minor candidates who were there to really confuse things and stir things up received enough votes so that the total vote count is over 100% of voters. I'm not quite sure how that happens, but apparently it's the new math. So we just have the outlines of not just a fraud, but just a outright theft. And it's interesting to think that the regime would consider that indeed they could get away with it, which they may not. And I want to come to that in a second. But the point is that the brazenness of this approach, in my view, should not have been a surprise, and yet it seems to have been a surprise to the United States, to Brazil, to some of the regional allies, indeed to Europe, and some of the countries that, well, they were trying to do scenarios exercises, and maybe Maduro would try to fiddle with some votes here, or maybe there was some discrepancies there. But the outright brazenness, I think, took people by surprise. And therefore, the responses that they were thinking about, for Sunday night or perhaps Monday morning reaction, was blown out of the water. I think that's point number one. And the real need to recalibrate based on the seriousness of what the regime has done. I think that's point number one. Point number two is even more serious, I think. And that is that as the international community is working to recalibrate, calling for transparency, insisting that the regime reveal the actual vote count as is required by Venezuela's own laws, and trying to get into a debate about, transparency and all these things that we take for granted in democracies. The regime has been using this time, these last 48 hours, to change the facts on the ground. And this is the part that I think that the international community has completely missed. Because right now, as we're talking in this Zoom call, right now, the regime is going after officials who contested the election on Sunday, poll watchers who were, they're the foot soldiers of democracy. They didn't have they're not candidates. They were watching the polls for fairness and for transparency themselves. Those folks are now being targeted I'm getting reports in real time, as I'm sure you are as well, that by regime thugs. People have started to die, unfortunately, right? The protests have begun, again, very predictable based on the fact that the regime just blatantly stole the elections. And so that hope, that extremely high hope for the first time in years in Venezuela for meaningful change, has been turned into frustration. And any good political scientist worth their salt would know that that's the very definition of the J curve. And once the population loses the hope and it turns to frustration, frustration turns to anger. And what do? You go from the voting booth to the street. And that's precisely what's happening right now. So the regime is faced with a choice, right? They can say, oops, we made a mistake. We are going to reveal the voting totals and we are going to admit defeat and we're going to do a 6-month transition and then we're going to go away to a gilded, exile in, in France or somewhere else. Probably not France, but anyway, wherever they end up. Or they can fight it out because they've really burned the bridges and they can decide not to go peacefully. And it appears as if they've made the latter choice. So that presents the international community with a dilemma. What do? Our leverage, in large measure, I think, is limited. Our being defined as the United States, but also more broadly, the democratic voices of the international community, for a couple of reasons. One is, you indicated in the introduction, exactly right. There are some countries that frankly support Maduro and have publicly said, congratulated him. Cuba, China, even I saw Honduras got into the act for reasons I can't quite understand. Well, I can't understand, but it's deeply disappointing. But having said that, the international community is not fully unified. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is that, the democracies themselves, look, we have other things that we need to be concerned about and worried about. I mean, not the least of which is, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East. And obviously in the United States, we have our own presidential elections too, which are thoroughly dominating discourse, at least in Washington, where I'm sitting right now, but presumably elsewhere around the country. So you've got some real challenges there just to try to focus on these issues, much less to try to coalesce an international response to really address an increasingly violent, an increasingly chaotic, an increasingly messy situation on the ground in Venezuela that nobody really has the chance to change from the outside, and nobody really wants to pay the political cost that it would take to actually try to do so. So that's a pretty depressing scenario if it ends there. I don't think it ends there. And here's the optimism, to the extent that there is any in this storyline. And the optimism is the Venezuelan people themselves. Look, for 25 years, they've suffered under increasingly, I mean, yes, it's ebbed and flowed, and Maduro's different from Chavez, and I get all that. But at least since 2013, the trajectory of Venezuela has been pretty uniformly down. And I know that Ricardo's going to talk about the economy, but it hasn't been a global star in terms of economic performance. Let's put it that way. I've actually said many times it's the example of or it's the best example of wealth destruction in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. I mean, I don't include the Aztecs and the Spaniards and all of that. That's not the modern history, but in the modern history, it's the greatest wealth destruction of any other example in the Western Hemisphere. That's because of Chavismo. And so, I think that after 25 years of this, the people have said enough. We have the chance to change it. We're going to. And, we've got the hope to change it, and we've lost the fear of what could happen if we go out and actually confront the government. So you have a people that have said enough. They've weathered it for 25 years, for generation. And so that resiliency, that hope for change, that willingness to take risks for democracy, which is really what it is. I mean, look, if you're a voter and you go to the voting booth and you vote for an opposition candidate in an authoritarian society with no guarantee that your vote is private, that's a risk for democracy. If you're a poll watcher in an authoritarian society and you're poll watching on behalf of the opposition, as we see right now in real time, that's a risk for democracy. If you're out in the street, if you're protesting non-violently, if you're just, expressing your right to protest, or your right to speech, but also demanding that the government of the country live up to its own constitution in an authoritarian country, that's a risk for democracy. So my point is the Venezuelan people are resilient. They're out in the streets. I don't know how long that can be sustained. And that is a real, that's the hope of the country. If the government cracks down, and there are indications, it already has in some ways, but there are indications that could be worse, you're going to have some violence. You're going to have, not from the protesters, from the government. They're the ones with the guns. And so here is where I end this part of the conversation, Michael, in terms of the key is, all of this background, all of this scenario comes back to one place, and that's the security forces in the military. They have the choice, right? I think most observers, myself included, would suggest that the leaders of the Venezuelan military, if not the police and maybe the colectivos as well, remain loyal to the regime. And why wouldn't they? They've been indoctrinated for 25 years, but more importantly, they've been given access to extraordinary levels of corruption that's funded by the by the illegal taking of the natural resources of the country. The wealth of the country is being privatized by individuals through corruption, while the top ranks of the military and security forces have been read into that opportunity, and they've taken full advantage. That doesn't occur. That's not true for everybody, right? The mid-levels, the lower levels, they don't have access to that level of corruption, and they and their families have to live in the same communities on the same local economy that are deteriorating and that are showing signs of real stress. The question is not, will they band together and try to overthrow Maduro? I'm not suggesting that. I think the question is even more basic than that. Will they shoot against their own citizens? Will they obey the order to shoot down protesters if it comes to that? And that's when they have to decide. And if indeed enough of the police and military say, you know what, not this time, then the regime loses its ability to enforce its will, at least in some sectors. That then has the opportunity to build the protests further. And you get into a scenario then where the longevity, the survivability of the regime itself becomes at risk. Look, I know there's a lot of ifs there. I know there's a lot of speculation. I know that this is one of many scenarios. I get it. But in the context of your provocative and appropriate leading question about what comes next, I believe this is a pretty good jumping off point.
There is a parallel, of course, in 20 plus years ago when the military and the police did not necessarily shoot at the protesters, and Chavez was driven out for a couple of days. He came back, of course. We all hope that something like what you're talking about will happen. Much of it will come, as you say, from the pressure from mostly from the Venezuelans themselves, but presumably also from the international community. The U.S. is very much in the target here. Max Boot today in the Washington Post said that, quote, Venezuela's stolen election shows the bipartisan failure of U.S. policy, unquote. Do you think U.S. policy is going to change? Will sanctions return? Will there be pressure? Will there be negotiations with Brazil and Colombia and others to move the Venezuelans somehow into a more hopeful path? Or will it be, let me quote someone else and then let you answer the question. Evan Ellis of the U.S. Army War College says, game's over. And he argues that that's the end. It's going to be Maduro for the time being. Is there a chance that the U.S. and its allies can bring enough pressure to support the Venezuelan people in the kind of actions you're talking about?
I think that the regime in Caracas is clearly battening down the hatches, waiting for such a response. They've gone through difficult times before, the so-called maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration. They have some very practiced advisors in the Cubans who have weathered the special period. They know how to live under sanctions and get done what they believe they need to do to maintain control of the country. They also recognize that if there is the scenario that goes forward where they maintain control, you'll probably see yet another migration outflow perhaps of millions additional Venezuelans. You already have 25% of the whole entire population outside the country. And that function as an escape valve, right? I mean, citizens who are dissatisfied, you know, if they're migrating, they're not fighting back. So this is something that I think the regime is probably focusing on. What can the U.S. and the international community do? I've been, I would have liked to have seen, even on Sunday night, but certainly yesterday as well, Monday, you know, a public recognition that Edmundo obtained the most votes of the voters in Venezuela. You don't have to declare him the president. It's not for the United States necessarily to declare who the president is, but it's a statement of fact that he won dramatically more votes than the next person who was running. Obviously, the implication is then that he is the president-elect of Venezuela. But nobody other than Peru, just as I saw maybe 2 or 3 hours ago, declared that to be the case. You have seen some positive statements, some strong statements from across the spectrum. Javier Milei was out with some very strong comments, you know, right after the vote. And of course, there's still 6 asylees seeking shelter in the Argentine embassy in Caracas right now. You've also seen from the other side, you know, President Boric from Chile make some very strong statements, and others as well. On the flip side, you've seen comments like the president of Mexico, who's taken a much different approach. Brazil has been sort of in between, right, as we've seen these public statements develop. So there is a range out there. Each country is going to make its own determination, but I wish that there had been, and there is, and there's still time to really highlight the fact that the vote was taken, the decision was made, and there is a winner, and it's not Maduro. So that's number one. Yeah. Number two, and I think this is situations developed in the last 48 hours subsequent to the vote. It's clear that the Maduro regime is doubling down. It's clear they're targeting people in the opposition for no reason other than that they're in the opposition. They haven't committed any crimes. And so the international community, I believe, should be saying, well, wait a minute, guys, this is absolutely unacceptable. This is not something that the international community will tolerate. What's our leverage to get them to stop that? Well, you know, everybody presumably has, you know, wants to maintain some sort of public role in life. You know, there are individual sanctions, there are criminal charges that can be brought. There's the case at the ICJ. There's all kinds of different things that can be alluded to and put in place, you know, to put people on notice. I mean, think hard before you pull that trigger, because there will be consequences. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but there will be consequences. And we've got your name and we've got your cedula. We know who you are. So let's not, you know, let's not hide under the cloak of anonymity. So well, I think you've got a couple.
You are right that the U.S. has not gone far enough. There are 9 Latin American countries which have openly, publicly criticized the vote, and all of their ambassadors have been expelled by the Maduro regime. Of course, we don't have an ambassador in Venezuela, but the United States is somewhere in between. Not quite being strong.
Michael, sorry for interrupting, but it's in line with Brazil and Colombia, the United States, and maybe some negotiation is taking place. And here you have a regime that needs guarantees. Where are they going to go? They have accusations. I mean, you could understand from a game theoretic perspective why they're acting the way they are acting. They have no guarantees. The guarantees are not in place. Or if they were, and if they could trust them, they would be acting in a different way. So I think I look at the U.S. reaction, and I don't think it's that bad. They wait, and hopefully they'll tighten when they need to tighten. But meanwhile, they're acting in line with what the way Colombia, which actually I think the Minister of the Exterior came out, I think, with a very strong statement, and Lula's coming out now with a relatively strong statement on votes needed to be counted. And let's see what they do after the government says the votes are not going to be counted. What happens next?
And Ricardo, and you did state your opinion yesterday about being overweight the bonds of Venezuela and PDVSA. And you probably have 2 different scenarios in your mind. I ask you, I mean, one is in which Maduro stays, the other one is one in which, like, he goes. How do you think about those in this context, no?
So I am not surprised at all that we are where we are. And that's my base case scenario was this one, where the government was going to commit fraud because they had no exit strategy. They were going to commit massive fraud, and then you're going to have an uproar, which we're having. I was not expecting public protests. And by the way, the protests this time are very different from the protest you mentioned, Eric, 2002. That was the middle class. And 2017, that was the middle class. Now it's general. It's general. It's the barriadas. Maduro has lost support. That does not necessarily mean that the Chavismo has lost support. I think they're two very different things. And I think that puts Maduro in a very, very tough spot. And my base case scenario is that the Chavismo, given the guarantees are not in place, that they need to control the transition. And I think Maduro's out. I think Maduro at the end, the same Chavistas will force him out. And then that's going to be more palatable for the international opinion. And by the way, all this election thing, Barbados Accord, the Barbados Accord, there's a point in the Barbados Accord that says, and this was agreed by the US, this was agreed by the EU, and this was agreed by the opposition. There's a point in the Barbados Accord that says that the banned candidates have to go before the judicial system, and the judicial system will determine whether the ban will be lifted or not. Who's the judicial system if not the regime? So they already knew that the regime was going to control who the opposition candidates were going to be, and they were all fine with that. Why? Why? And I think that's a question worth asking. And it's very different from a free and transparent election. It was never going to be free and transparent. The way it was designed is for not to be free and transparent. It was for the government to control who the opposition candidate was going to be, and they were all fine with it. They made a mistake. They thought the opposition was going to be divided, that they were going to be unmotivated, that the candidates by dividing the opposition with different candidates like Rauseo and Enrique Marquez. And by the way, Enrique Marquez came out yesterday very strong, saying that the government had committed fraud, that they had people in the totalization room, and that the numbers that Amoroso is showing are not the right numbers. So the government made a big mistake, and I think it's making a huge mistake now. And I think that their position is untenable.
Yes. So now the pressure is mounting. You have like governments asking for transparency. Show me the actas. I mean, most of the countries are in that phase right now. I mean, you even have like Peru, according to Bloomberg, they recognize already Edmundo González as a president based on the ballots. I mean, what do you think the negotiation is going to be looking like if it happens? I mean, in order to give that exit to Maduro and to the team, if it happens, what do you think negotiation is going to be like? And Eric and Ricardo, what do you think about those? And also Michael, you have, as an ambassador, you were part of some of these negotiations, probably also, like, what do you think the scenario looks like on the negotiations?
Well, remember, I was an ambassador in the last century, so I'm not exactly up on.
Well, but negotiations have been taking place forever, and regime changes have taken place for a long time.
Yes.
So it would be interesting to see what you have to.
Well, say. I would be certain. I am certain right now that there are negotiations going on, not necessarily directly with the Maduro regime, but I am confident that there are talks going on between the United States, Brazil in particular. President Biden is said to have talked with Lula today. Because Brazil, Lula in particular is an obvious potential intermediary with the Maduro people. Colombia, for various reasons. I'm not so sure about Mexico, but my experience tells me that we have probably spread wide amongst embassies and other agencies. What do you think? Do you think the government to which you are accredited would be willing to do this or that? So I think negotiations are probably going on about what's next, where the Maduro people think they really are is I'm not sure. Their tendency, as Eric said, as I think we all know, is they're good. They're going to stay in. It's just on the one hand, it's too profitable to leave, and it's too dangerous to leave. So another phrase other than negotiations is the so-called off-ramp. This has been used over and over again in parallel histories. What do you say to a Maduro and all the dozens of others ranking people in the civilian and military regimes? What can you guarantee? What do you say to them? It's more difficult now than it has been in the past because there's more countries, more agencies, more actors involved. The U.S., we're very much divided. So what one party does, the other party won't like, probably. But you have to say to a Maduro, okay, if you go to country X, whether it's Brazil or Honduras, that's a great place to go to. We promise not to ask for your extradition from Brazil or Honduras or any other country. That's not an absolute guarantee because the U.S. is not the only country that has Maduro on his blacklist. And you never know what the attorney general or the governor of Florida might do. There's all kinds of this is like a Rubik's cube in a language that we don't understand. But I'm sure people are working on it. And if the pressure is enough, and again, if the scenario that Ricardo and Eric have alluded to, in other words, will the military and the police at a middle and lower level, will they actually shoot? Will they drop their weapons? Will they join the protesters? If something like that happens, that's the red light to the Maduro regime, and everything else. Now, I personally think we should never have dropped sanctions. To me, this hope that we ought to engage in Venezuela because we need more oil on the world market to lower the price in the U.S. is, that's asking to pump oil out of an empty barrel to a very large extent. And the economy, Ricardo, you could comment on where the economy of Venezuela is likely to go from here. You know a lot more about it than I do. What's going to happen to the Venezuelan economy in one or another scenario?
Well, I even think, and it's something very interesting, the Maduro administration had been opening up the oil sector, and Eric talked about sectors of the economy, or not the economy, groups that support Maduro, that say the military making a fortune with certain sectors, and the oil sector was one. The imports of foods was another. That's all been taken away from them. Now you have like the Chevron agreement. What does that mean? You're taking power away from somebody to give it to Chevron. Chevron is effective with that contract. You're effectively privatizing the production of oil, not the ownership, but the production. Before PDVSA was involved in a lot of things like procurement, human resources, finance. Now it's everything. Let's call it just Chevron because it's a Chevron model. And then how fast can you increase production under that? That's the question I ask myself when I think about recovery values in Venezuela and debt. But so these guys realized that with China, with Russia, and with Turkey and Iran, they could not maintain. They held to power, but they could not maintain it for a very long time. That's why they were opening up. And I do think that the world was ready. And if I read the Barbados Accord, the world was ready to deal with Maduro and not to live with Maduro, not to deal with, to live with Maduro. That's what the Barbados Accord told me when I read it. It's like they're willing to. And the same thing with the Chevron license. The U.S., forget oil, it's all about immigrants. They want less immigrants going, and then the Europe needs to diversify their energy base. So Venezuela's there. It's not the first time the U.S. government and the EU deal with an authoritarian regime. Let's learn how to live with it. And that's, I think, what they were doing. They were being pragmatic. And then things suddenly changed because the game changed dramatically with Maria Corina coming with 2 million votes in the primaries. And then suddenly it's like, whoa, this is not what we expected, not even the US or the EU. And it's a totally different game. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we talk about guarantees and everything. You know, Maria Corina has surprised everybody in how pro-election she's been. In the past, she had been anti-election. I mean, she could be the one maybe given the guarantees that the government needs. Who knows? I hope so. I hope so. And by the way, I mean, this whole idea of Venezuela being wealthy, Venezuela was not wealthy. Oil production dropped between 1970 to 1984. That's my childhood. It dropped 56%. That's why Chavez won. It's a country where the middle class disappeared. That's why Chavez won. And Chavez was lucky. He got the oil production increases that we had with the apertura that was designed under Caldera, and oil prices. And he did deliver to the people, unsustainably, but he did deliver transfers to the people, and people felt very happy with that. They're not getting that. The country's gone to a tailspin, and now they're demanding change. They're demanding change, and Maduro can't deliver change.
Just a reminder, people feel free to ask questions in the button below. I mean, I do see some people that have raised their hand. Michael McKinley, Ambassador, if you don't mind writing your question, we'll be able to take it soon. Eric, can you follow on the question from Mike?
Okay, let me, let's see. Okay, we have a number of questions here. Let me start with an anonymous attendee. Is this time really different? How long can we rely on democratic means? What breaks here? Do we rely on negotiations, foreign military intervention, local military upheaval? Eric?
I guess the only thing I could say is we'll see if it's different based on what happens in the coming days. I mean, as of now, it's we've seen the pattern before. But what if it is different? What I think the reason why is because, and you know, Ricardo said it, it's Maria Corina herself has inspired hope in a country that hadn't had it, or at least hadn't had the idea that change was actually possible through the ballot box. So from my perspective, that could sustain the public protest to the point where the lower levels or the mid levels of the security forces, as we've been talking about, might decide at that point that, you know, it's in their interest not to aggressively follow the orders of the regime. Having said that, if the protests are put down violently or non-violently, but if they're put down in the next day or so, next couple of days, you know, it really is up to the people of Venezuela whether this is going to be different this time or not. The international community has some things we can say, we can have some things we can do, but at the end of the day, our leverage on the ground, I think, is limited.
A question from Edward Verona. Is it possible that Maduro will use the Essequibo claim to provoke an international crisis and divert attention from the election fraud and perhaps impose martial law? Anyone?
I mean,
Can I go back to the this time is different? Sure. Because I think it is different. I think it's very, very different. And is that this time it's a popular popular revolt. It's popular social protest. It's not the middle class. That was Chavez's base, and that base has been lost by Maduro, not necessarily by the Chavismo. So I think this is a huge distinction. And then you're in 2020 in 2017. The economy was still okay and they still had some savings here. I mean, we've had the GDP collapse 70%. I mean, I think it's very different, and it's going to be difficult for the regime to maintain power, I think, and that makes it very different. And Essequibo, they tried doing something during the election. I mean, right now they're going to divert repression and send the military to the border and leave Miraflores unguarded. I doubt it. So I don't see that. I don't know, Eric, if you.
No, nothing to add. I saw the Essequibo as a potential pre-election ploy, but now that the election has taken place, I don't think that's a high likelihood.
I thought the Essequibo could be the Falklands for Maduro, but.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question from David Lewis. Hi, David. Welcome your views on the role of Cuba and Nicaragua in support of their third key partner and well experienced in staying firm and strong in power. Also, Lula and Petro are well compromised to push Maduro too far, since they owe their political economic livelihoods from 1980s, 1990s to Ortega and Castro, regardless of supposed softening ideologically. Anybody?
You know, I don't think Nicaragua is playing a game right now in Caracas, but I would say this, that the elections that Ortega held for himself in 2021 were actually a dry run for what happened just Sunday in Caracas. I mean, you almost had exactly the same playbook run. You know, it was Nicaragua with Venezuelan characteristics. And so from my perspective, as one who, you know, has been calling that play for a long time, you know, I've said, guys, watch what the Nicaraguans did in 2021. It's being repeated in Caracas in 2024. And we need to have something to say the day after, unlike in Nicaragua, which we're still debating if we're going to keep them as a free trade partner or not. So, you know, these types of issues, you can talk about it as long as you want in the diplomatic space, and you can call for transparency, and I support all of that. The facts on the ground are changing right now. That's the point, right? Maduro is moving now against his opponents, and you know, he is going to have, and we'll reject it. The international community will say, you know, all the right things, and we'll condemn him, and we'll pull ambassadors, and we'll have OAS resolutions, and we'll write op-eds, and we'll do all the things we normally do, and Maduro won't care, because his one goal is and will remain staying in power. I'm not a big believer that the whole off-ramp discussion is meaningful in that context at all. Because his role isn't, he's not looking for a sinecure. He's not looking to go to the south of France with a fancy fortune. He's looking to remain in power in Venezuela. That's what's driving the entire, you know, cabal of folks who are right now in Caracas. So, you know, we can come up with these scenarios in the think tank world in various places, and I've heard all of them, or most of them, I think, but, and they make sense in a vacuum. But the one thing that they don't take account of is the fundamental nature of the regime in power in Caracas. The DNA of Chavismo is to gain and maintain power. And, you know, that's what we're dealing with. And so I think in that context, sure, the Cubans have been a very strong, you know, support for that. You also have the Chinese and the Russians we can talk about, Nicaragua, as David mentioned, et cetera. But, you know, at the end of the day, my view, and others disagree with this, I have no problem saying that, but my view is that the motivating, you know, inclination of the government in Venezuela today is to maintain power. And if you put it in that context, everything that's happened up to this point makes sense.
But you have to, I mean, you talked about the DNA of El Chavismo to stay in power. So it might be in the best interest of El Chavismo to get rid of Maduro.
That's a really, well, that's a very fair point. And
so that's what I think at the end.
I think that's a really interesting scenario.
So that's what that's my main scenario. And my main scenario was that initially the U.S. and Europe were willing to work with Maduro. Now they will be willing to work with El Chavismo. And with Maduro out, it's very easy to say, okay, let's lift sanctions, let's deal. And that transition is happening.
So let's play that out a little, because I'm really glad you raised that. I think it's a very interesting scenario. I don't know the likelihood. You're closer to that aspect than I would be. But if that's the case, then the question that David just asked about Cuba and Nicaragua takes on a different, you know, characteristic, because their interests, perhaps, I'm speculating here, I haven't talked to the Cubans either, but, you know, their interest perhaps is maintaining a friendly regime in Venezuela that will support they being Cuba in this instance, their strategic interests in terms of energy, oil, force projection, all of those things. And if they believe that Maduro is an imperfect vehicle to do that, who knows? So that's, I'm really glad you raised that point. I think it's it's really interesting to discuss it.
Well, here's a question that
and Maduro is not Ortega. Ortega was the leader of a revolution. Maduro's not Fidel, another leader of a revolution. And I think the approach that Colombia and Brazil have taken really surprised me. And when I saw it, I said, wow, this could be a game changer, because they have been supporters of Maduro in the past, and they have been supporters of definitely supporters of Chavez, and the approach you're taking is very different. And immigration is a big issue across all of America. I mean, Venezuelans are a big issue across the Americas and even Spain. So it's a different ball game. It's a very different ball game.
Let me, there's an anonymous attendee who asked a sort of follow-up question to what we've been talking about. Can you please comment who has more power now if Maduro is not in? Minister of Defense Padrino or Vice President Cabello? And would they be acceptable successors, or would they look for an off-ramp too?
So can I take that one?
Yes.
So Cabello is not the vice president. The vice president is Delcy Delcy Rodriguez, and I think the military here have a way out to save themselves as an institution and be part of the transition to democratize Venezuela. And maybe they're thinking about it. And today there's a TikTok of two military guys actually saying exactly this. Let's lead a transition. So they have an opportunity, and maybe they're thinking of them leading it and then sitting down with the U.S. and Europe to negotiate where the generals can go and spend the money they have. My main case scenario is that the Chavismo, which controls the National Assembly, will have a constitutional reform, and then you will not have, if Maduro resigns, and then you have the vice president stay in. That is it's going to happen. I have no idea, but that is, I think, a way for the Chavismo to stay in control of a transition that seems to be already happening. And I don't see Maduro, given how unpopular he is and the rejection he has of how Maduro, without repression, and he needs to repress, staying in power.
Here's a question from Michael McKinley, Ambassador McKinley. As we speak, Maduro, Rodriguez, and Diosdado are asking for Maria Corina to be arrested. It is a matter of hours where a more concerted international response will be required. Do we see the U.S. or others reacting in any meaningful way?
You would know better than I, but I would hope they would.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, will they? Who knows? But what I said in my initial comments was this is one of two things that I would strongly support doing, yesterday, but certainly now. You got to stand up for the fighters for democracy. You got to call them by name and say Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo Gonzalez, Leopoldo Lopez, who's also being subject now to lawfare and some of these other things. These people haven't done anything, and the international community is watching. And to my knowledge, and again, I don't have perfect information, but to my knowledge, that hadn't been done yet, and I don't know why.
Okay, here's something from Leah Campos. What is the Biden-Harris's admin's calculation in issuing such a weakly worded statement? Is this leading from behind? Would a strong U.S. statement recognizing the clear victory of the opposition provide the type of moral support needed across the military to not take part in the regime's desperate repression?
It seems to me that the U.S. is working hand in hand with Colombia and Brazil, and maybe Mexico, and they're looking for a negotiated solution. If they have a stronger stance, I think that closes a possibility of negotiating. I mean, you are more of an expert in that than me, but I mean that's the way I see it, and I rationalize it. And there has to be, and I hope there is, a red line. I mean, Maria Corina is in prison, and then you really have to, that's it. I mean, that's you can't take that. But they're leaving a room open for negotiations. I don't know, Eric, if you.
No, I concur with that. I think the question Lee is raising is that the right approach, but I do agree that's the approach that's been taken. And I would also say, and I don't think it's come up yet in the conversation, but just as a data point, Celso Amorim, as I understand it, is still in Caracas. And, the phone call today between Presidents Biden and Lula, obviously there's coordination there on the ground, and Celso Amorim does have the ability to talk to Maduro. He does have the credibility, street cred, as the kids would say, but he's got that in a way that perhaps, I mean, you could suggest that the United States doesn't, for all the reasons we know. So that's an interesting approach as well. you know, I haven't talked to Celso Amorim about this, but clearly, you know, he is somebody who's in a position to try to move this process along, if that's the approach he's taking, and if he's being listened to. I thought, and I tweeted out over the weekend, sometime during the election process, that in my view, there are really two people that have that ability to do that. One is Diaz-Canel from Cuba, who, for reasons we just talked about, won't do that. And the second is Celso Amorim. So, you know, people aren't reading my tweets necessarily, but at least I'm thinking along the same lines.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Here's an anonymous attendee. Nothing material would be done if Maria Corina is arrested. The regime, like any other regimes, keeps getting away with atrocities.
That's not a question, that's a statement.
That's a statement.
It's a real risk. I mean, look, you know, and she's not in the same position. She doesn't have the same profile, but somebody like a Rocio San Miguel was just kidnapped, taken, thrown into prison, you know, hasn't been heard from for weeks or, you know, months. It's just absolutely outrageous. And she's just been disappeared. And now, again, Maria Corina does not have that profile. She has a different profile, but you know, what's behind the questioner's comment, I think, is a real frustration that a lot of people feel is, you know, the regime has acted with impunity on the ground, and there's really limited ability of the international community within the framework of actions that people are prepared to take to have the leverage to change behavior on the ground in Venezuela. And I think from that perspective, it's probably, you know, true to a greater extent. That's why I think, and I think we're all agreeing on this, but correct me if I'm wrong, that something needs to be said about, you know, the regime's efforts right now to target, whether it's through the Attorney General or through some other aspect, to target the leaders of the opposition and try to link them with this ridiculous, you know, made up plot from North Macedonia about cyber attacks on the night of the, you know, and we understand Maria Corina was behind that. I mean, yeah, right. I mean, the whole thing is just ludicrous on its face. And yet it provides the so-called legal basis to go after these leaders. That stuff can't happen, and it has to be called out.
Here's one from Philip French. What role can the Carter Center play? They still haven't issued a full report.
I think they did, no? I think they did mention, not the full report, but they did issue a statement about their view of elections, no?
No, they issued a report, basically, not a report, a statement very similar to what the other countries, most countries are saying, that you need to audit you need to audit the votes. And they have withheld their reports, and the UN, or not the UN, because at the end it's the Secretary General that sent the mission, not the UN. The Secretary General said exactly the same. Thing. And by the way, I think you could have what you're seeing, this massive repression. It's just the leadership of Maduro's government, and you could have a reaction from El Chavismo saying, you know what, you're making us untenable. So and you could have a break. This could cause a break, and I think that's where things can happen. Things can happen.
Well, I happen to agree with Eric about where this is likely to wind up. Someone said that the regime is acting now with impunity. This regime has acted with impunity for over 2 decades, and this is just a continuation.
So, so has Chavez. I mean, Chavez acted with
yeah, that's what I mean. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me conclude this part of it with not a question, but a summary statement from Mike McKinley, Ambassador McKinley. In other words, Evan Ellis's scenario that this may already be over may materialize. Any comments further on that? And Eric, Ricardo, final comments on overall on what we're seeing, what we can expect, what we can hope for in Venezuela. Ricardo?
I think what we can see is a transition within El Chavismo, and a transition controlled by El Chavismo, and maybe they'll call for some sort of national unity government. And I hope it's the opposition is able to take power, and if they do, I hope to see them being very, very open. I would hate to see Venezuela go the Bolivia way, and not be, very radical against the Chavismo, and be open, and allow for things to move more slowly, and we don't end up like Bolivia.
I sincerely hope you are right. I have a different opinion. Let me put it that way. Eric, final comments.
Just quickly, I mean, again, this is all speculation. We don't know what will happen in an hour, much less tomorrow or in a year from now. But obviously, we hope for the best. I continue to think that the result, or that's the wrong word, the outcome is in the hands of the Venezuelans themselves, and hopefully the people with the guns will realize that, it's not legal to shoot at unarmed protesters who are exercising their democratic rights on behalf of their own constitution. I think that's the fundamental issue as I see it. Whether or not they will, abide by those rules or not is something that we can't say. But the thing that I think we have to say as we conclude is it's extraordinary the bravery of those folks in Venezuela right now fighting for democracy. I mean, I am stunned by the risks to her personal existence that Maria Corina Machado continues to take every day, that Edmundo Gonzalez has taken, that there are 6 asylees in the Argentine embassy right now whose lives have been completely disrupted. The people in the streets. To me, people like me, I sit here in Washington in my air-conditioned office, and I have these opinions, right? I'm not fighting for democracy the way somebody on the street is right now in Caracas or Maracaibo. And to me, that's where the heroes are. And I don't think it can be said enough. People are taking risks and paying costs for democracy. And we have to acknowledge that. So that's where I would end my comments.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Eric. I mean, they're extremely brave. What they're doing.
Yeah, and so do I. Obviously, let's and a special salute and prayer for the hostages, or those in the Argentine embassy in Caracas. Remember, the Argentine ambassador is being thrown out of the country by Maduro. What does that mean for the Venezuelan opposition leaders who are huddled there
at the embassy,
waiting for the next boot to drop? Anyway, I will pass this to Carlos, but and I'm sure he will mention it. But stay tuned. A week from today, not sure what time, the very distinguished and articulate head of Latin America for the Financial Times, Michael Stott, will be with us a week from today at one point, we don't know, to talk about what a week from now, a whole world of events can occur between now and then. Carlos, to you.
No, 100%, Mike. Thanks, Ricardo and Eric, for joining us today. Yes, certainly a week from now, the world may be changing a lot, especially for Venezuela. So we'll keep people informed. I mean, as Michael was saying, we'll have Michael Stott next week, who is in Caracas right now, attending a webinar. We'll send a planner an invitation to everybody who joined today. I'd like to give some thanks as well, of course, to Michael for moderating. Our team, Linda Calvet, Lori Dominguez, and Sebastian Lopez for putting this together. And we're working, as you know, for other future programs, and we'll let you know as soon as they are confirmed. If anybody has an interest in joining VAUS, the Venezuela American Association, please contact our team via today's invitation, your memberships, and we'll make our work possible. Thanks a lot to everybody for participating today. Thanks.
And
thank
don't
you guys.
vote
Michael,
here in
great
November.
pleasure, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.